I've reported on tragedies that left communities shaken, but none quite like this. What you're about to hear will disturb you because it should. It's the true story of a woman who lived with courage in a world that too often demands silence. A woman who dared to exist in her fullness, who dared to be visible, and paid the ultimate price. Dominique Fells was a black transgender woman who should be here today, laughing, dancing, living. But someone chose to end her life in one of the most gruesome and hate-filled acts this country has seen in recent years. This is not just about murder. It's about the constant threat trans women, especially black trans women, live with every single day. It's about the fight to be recognized, to be protected, to be seen. And it all begins on a humid June evening in Philadelphia, the night the world lost Mie. Dominique Fells was born on November 26, 1992. She grew up in Philadelphia, a city known for its grit, history, and spirit, and she was all three. Mie wasn't just another name or face. She was magnetic. People remember her wild, contagious laughter, the way she carried herself with confidence that turned heads and opened hearts. She was expressive, often dancing down sidewalks, posing with flair in bold outfits, and making art that mirrored her soul. Even as a child, Mie knew she was different, but difference didn't scare her. She embraced her truth with the kind of fearlessness most only pretend to have. She transitioned openly and unapologetically, even when it meant walking into a world that saw her as a target. Still, she smiled. She lived. Mie was working toward a career in fashion and dreamed of creating safe spaces for LGBTQ+ youth. She talked about opening a community house one day, where black trans women wouldn't just survive, but thrive. She poured herself into advocacy because she had felt what it was like to walk alone. But being visible in a society that still treats transgender lives as disposable came with its dangers. Mie knew the risk of being out, but she chose authenticity anyway. That kind of bravery shouldn't cost you your life. But for Dominique, it did. June 8th, 2020. The day began like so many others. Philadelphia was slowly reopening after COVID lockdowns. The streets buzzed with heat and hope. Mie left her apartment that afternoon. Surveillance footage would later show her stepping outside around 2 p.m., dressed casually, texting on her phone. She was communicating with a man later identified as a Kenaton Jones, a 36-year-old with a disturbing record. They had met not long before, some say through mutual acquaintances, others say online. The details remain murky. What's clear is this: Dominique trusted him enough to get in that car. Witnesses recalled seeing her enter a silver or gray sedan on the corner of 58th and Walnut around 4:30 p.m. She looked comfortable, at ease, smiling. That smile would be the last memory anyone had of her alive. What happened next remains partially unknown, but what we do know paints a horrifying picture, one of manipulation, betrayal, and a simmering rage that boiled over. June 10th, just 2 days later. A group of young boys playing near the Schuylkill River made a gruesome discovery. They spotted something floating near the banks, wrapped tightly in plastic and tangled in brush. They thought it was debris. It wasn't. When police arrived, they uncovered one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Philadelphia's recent history. A dismembered torso, legs severed just above the thigh, no head, no arms, deep stab wounds along the torso. The body had been mutilated with a brutality that shook even veteran detectives. Bound in trash bags, tied with construction twine, dumped like waste. Using unique tattoos and later forensic medical records, the victim was identified: Dominique Fells. Her body showed signs of prolonged torture. It wasn't a quick or impulsive kill. It was calculated, deliberate, meant to erase. But Dominique could not be erased. As detectives retraced Dominique's final steps, one name kept surfacing: Akhenaton Jones. Jones had a long criminal record: assault, domestic violence, firearms violations. He was known for volatility, charming in public but quick to anger behind closed doors. Phone records placed him near the scene. Text messages showed he and Dominique had spoken multiple times in the hours before she disappeared. And then, he vanished. Jones ditched his apartment, left behind all personal belongings, turned off his phone. To law enforcement, it was clear. This wasn't a man running from grief. He was running from guilt. Philadelphia authorities issued a warrant for first-degree murder. The manhunt began locally, then expanded nationally as tips poured in. Dominique's case gained traction online. Her story was shared by activists, celebrities, and thousands of ordinary citizens who refused to let her name be forgotten. Social media carried her face into millions of homes. She became a rallying cry for justice. Then came the break. U.S. Marshals tracked Jones to Los Angeles. He was hiding in a decrepit, abandoned building, living under a fake name. He was captured in a crawl space, filthy and desperate. His silence during arrest said more than words ever could. Jones was flown back to Philadelphia in chains. He was charged with murder, abuse of corpse, obstruction, and other felonies. During the trial, Dominique's family sat in painful silence. Her mother wore her daughter's favorite color, lavender, every day. Her brothers stared at the man who had stolen their sister. Jones barely blinked. No remorse, no regret. His defense was thin. He claimed panic, claimed fear, claimed confusion. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. Dominique had been stabbed multiple times, dismembered with precision. This wasn't panic. It was hatred in its purest form. The jury found Akhenaton Jones guilty on all counts. The judge delivered the sentence: life in prison, no parole, no leniency. But for the people who loved Dominique, that wasn't enough. No verdict could return her laughter. No sentence could fill the hole she left behind. Yet Dominique's death wasn't in vain. Her story ignited protests, fueled new legislation, inspired city grants for LGBTQ+ housing and protection programs. She made the world listen. She made us say her name: Dominique Fells. She was joy. She was fire. She was truth. Her name was Dominique Fells. And though her life was stolen, her light continues to burn. In every march, every protest, every law changed, and every life saved. Say her name, honor her truth, protect others like her, because the world is watching, and silence is no longer an option. Dominique Fells, gone too soon, but never forgotten. She wore bright lipstick and bold lashes. She took selfies that captured her joy. She danced to TikTok videos and shared inspiration with others. Her name was Bee Love Slater, and her light was undeniable. But one early morning in rural Florida, that light was extinguished in the most horrifying way imaginable. Her body was found burned beyond recognition, trapped in a car that had been set ablaze. This is not just a murder story. This is a hate story. A story of what happens when transphobia festers unchecked, when fear, ignorance, and cruelty meet. Bee Love was only 23. Her killers remain unknown. But her truth cannot be erased. Bee Love Slater was born in Florida in 1996. She was vibrant, unapologetic, and fearless. As a black transgender woman in the American South, life was not always easy. But Bee lived boldly anyway. Friends and family described her as joyful. She loved makeup, fashion, music. She was the kind of person who filled a room with energy, a lover of color, creativity, and connection. She had a close-knit circle that respected her identity. She also had dreams, big ones. She wanted to own her own business, inspire others, and live out loud. But living authentically, in a place like Clewiston, came with danger. In the months leading up to her murder, Bee confided in close friends that she feared for her life. She had received threats, text messages, DMs. She felt she was being followed, but when asked if she wanted to go to the police, she hesitated. Because Bee knew. In many small towns, trans women, especially trans women of color, don't find safety in systems. They find suspicion, disrespect, dismissal. She tried to keep her head down. She deleted posts. She changed her routines. But the threats didn't stop, and neither did her fear. On the night of September 3, 2019, Bee attended a gathering in Pahokee, a town roughly 30 minutes from her home in Clewiston. She was dressed up, full face, confident, smiling. At some point, Bee left the party. Friends believed she had arranged to meet someone privately. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. At around 5 a.m. on September 4, 2019, sheriff's deputies were called to a remote road in Clewiston. A vehicle was engulfed in flames. Firefighters responded. What they found inside haunted them. The body of a young person, burned beyond recognition. The heat had melted the car's frame. The body was charred. But inside that destruction, investigators found the truth. It was Bee Love Slater. Her ID was located nearby. Friends who hadn't heard from her confirmed the worst. She hadn't just been murdered, she had been erased, or so her killers thought. The investigation began immediately, but early signs were troubling. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses, no camera footage, and few leads. What authorities did learn was chilling. Bee had arranged to meet someone that night. She told a friend she was nervous about it. She texted that she felt something was off. And then, she disappeared. Despite evidence that Bee had received death threats, local law enforcement was hesitant to classify the case as a hate crime. Advocates were outraged. The brutality of the murder, the threats she had reported, the community context, it all pointed to bias. After Bee's death, there was no arrest, no trial, no resolution. Her family mourned in private. The LGBTQ+ community mourned publicly. But the media? Silent. Major outlets failed to report her story. Bee Love's name should have been on every front page, but like many trans women of color, her murder was treated as an afterthought. What message does that send? That some lives matter less? That some deaths don't deserve justice? In the years since her death, Bee Love's story has not been forgotten. Her photo, bold, smiling, radiant, has appeared in protests, murals, marches. Activists say her name alongside other women lost to transphobic violence. Her case became a symbol for everything wrong with how society treats trans lives. In 2019 alone, at least 27 trans or gender non-conforming people were killed in the U.S., most of them Black transgender women. Bee was one of them. Bee Love Slater loved out loud. She didn't hide. She didn't apologize. She existed in full color until someone decided she didn't deserve to exist at all. Her killers have not been caught. Her case remains unsolved, but her name will never be forgotten. Say her name, Bee Love Slater. In America, where freedom is supposedly promised to all, simply being yourself is still a radical act. And sometimes, it's a dangerous one. This is not just a story of a killing. It's about silence enforced with violence, about shame that turned fatal, and a society that often looks away until the blood is already on the ground. Dime Doe was a bright, radiant force, a proud Black transgender woman living boldly in the conservative heart of South Carolina. She made her own rules, she stood in her truth, and she did it in a town that wasn't ready to accept her existence. But someone in that town knew her well, too well. Someone who shared a secret with her, one that he would do anything to bury, even kill. What happened next shattered not only a family and a community, but carved a new path in legal history. This is the haunting, historic, and deeply human story of Dime Doe. To understand the weight of her loss, you first have to know who she was. Dime Doe, born Daquan Doe, wasn't someone you could easily forget. In Allendale, South Carolina, a rural town where news travels fast and silence runs deep, she was unmistakable. Her fashion turned heads. Her presence commanded respect. But it was her energy, sharp, hilarious, unapologetically confident, that made her unforgettable. Dime was the kind of person who transformed pain into performance. She had style, dreams, and ambition. She wanted to open a beauty salon, not just to do hair, but to give other girls like her a safe space to feel beautiful in a world that told them they weren't. She had a way of lighting up small rooms. Her laugh bounced off walls like music. Her clapbacks were legendary. But for all her outer strength, she carried the weight of being a black trans woman in the South, something that meant navigating threats, judgment, and isolation just for existing. Still, she held her head high. She wasn't trying to be accepted. She already accepted herself. That alone made her dangerous to the right person, or the wrong one. Daqua Lamique Ritter. His name wasn't known outside the county until the day he made history, for all the wrong reasons. Ritter was a familiar face in Allendale, not a star but visible, someone who knew the streets and who knew the culture. He had an image to uphold, a man's man, tough, masculine, straight. But behind closed doors, the story was different. According to federal prosecutors, Ritter and Dime were involved in a private, secretive relationship, one he would never admit to. There were no love letters, no selfies, nothing public, only late-night conversations, occasional visits, and always an understanding that this could never get out. That secrecy turned into something darker, fear. The kind of fear that festers when you believe the truth about yourself is more dangerous than any lie you can tell. Whispers started to swirl. Rumors picked up steam. It wasn't unusual. People talked about Dime all the time, but in small towns, rumors can be lethal. Then came a Facebook post, maybe just a comment, a name tag, a screenshot. Whatever it was, it triggered something inside Ritter. Suddenly, his fear became desperation, and Dime Doe, his secret, became a problem he thought needed solving. It was August 4th, 2019, a Sunday, the kind of summer night where the heat clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. Dime was seen getting into a silver sedan near her home. She wasn't alarmed. She knew the driver. That driver, authorities would confirm, was Daqua Ritter. They drove down a quiet back road just outside of Allendale, a place where the trees crowd the edges of the pavement and the silence swallows sound. And then, somewhere in that silence, Dime was executed. 3 gunshots, all to the head. No struggle, no robbery, no warning. She was left in the middle of the road, abandoned like she meant nothing. But the message was clear. This wasn't just a murder. This was an erasure. Her belongings weren't stolen. Her jewelry was intact. Only her phone was destroyed, smashed, likely to hide communications. And still, even in death, Dime exposed a truth her killer was trying to bury. Initially, the investigation moved slowly, too slowly. Local authorities misgendered her in reports, delaying key evidence. Media coverage was minimal, but something stirred at the federal level. The FBI and Department of Justice began digging deeper. Cell tower data tracked Ritter's movements. His car was caught on surveillance near Dime's home before the murder. But the real crack came when a witness stepped forward, a friend of Ritter's who later told investigators that Ritter had admitted what he did. He said he had to shut her up. Those were the words that changed the entire direction of the case. This wasn't about personal conflict. This was about identity, about control, about shame so deep it turned deadly. The federal government reclassified the case. This wasn't just homicide. This was a hate crime. Using the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, federal prosecutors brought charges against Ritter. It marked the first time in U.S. history that the federal government charged someone with a hate crime for murdering a transgender person because of their gender identity. The weight of that moment cannot be overstated. In the courtroom, Dime's friends and family filled the gallery. They wore purple, her favorite color. Her face was on buttons, T-shirts, and posters. Her presence was everywhere, even though her chair sat empty. The prosecution laid out the evidence: text messages, GPS data, witness testimony, ballistic reports. They painted a picture not just of a murder, but of a motive rooted in bias and fear. Ritter's defense tried to argue it wasn't about hate, but the facts told a different story. A story where Dime's truth threatened Ritter's image. A story where being found out meant risking everything. So he killed her to protect a lie. On March 5, 2024, the verdict came in. Daqua Lamique Ritter was sentenced to life in federal prison. No parole, no appeal. The ruling was more than a punishment. It was a declaration that trans lives matter under the law, that hate will not go unchallenged. Activists, allies, and lawmakers called it a turning point, a sign that change, however slow, was still possible. Outside the courthouse, Dime's cousin spoke into a sea of cameras. "I'm glad he's gone. But she's still gone, too." Her voice cracked, but she stood tall, just like Dime would have. Dime Doe was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a cousin, a friend. She was a fire that burned brightly in a town that tried to snuff her out. Today, her name is etched into legal history, but more importantly, it lives on in every trans girl who walks a little taller, because Dime showed her how. Her murder was meant to silence her. Instead, it sparked a movement. Let her name be more than a headline. Let it be a call to do better, to see people, to protect them, to honor their right to simply live. Say her name. Say it loudly. Dime Doe. Some murders are committed in the dark, by strangers, by unknown enemies. Others are committed in daylight, by those who once kissed you goodnight. She was born into a world that told her she was wrong. She lived in a land where being transgender wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. But even so, she smiled, danced, and built a life. Until her own brother, her own flesh and blood, decided that her truth was an insult, a disgrace, and that for living as herself, she deserved to die. This is the tragic, horrifying case of Dosski Azad, the young Kurdish woman murdered in cold blood, not by a stranger, but by someone who was supposed to protect her. This is a story of honor, shame, and what happens when culture is used to justify cruelty. Dosski Azad was born in Duhok, Iraqi Kurdistan. To most, Duhok was a place where traditions ran deep, where family, reputation, and cultural norms shaped every corner of life. But for Dosski, it was a cage. From a very young age, she knew she was different. She didn't feel at home in the gender assigned to her. While others insisted she hide, pretend, obey, Dosski wanted to live, love, and be seen. She came out as transgender in her teens. In a place like Duhok, that decision was not just brave, it was revolutionary. But it came at a cost. Her family rejected her. She was disowned, kicked out, left to fend for herself. Many would have given up. But Dosski, she didn't. She carved out her own identity and refused to be erased. Alone, with nothing but her will to survive, Dosski became a makeup artist and influencer. Her skills were undeniable. Her Instagram and TikTok began gaining traction, showing off her transformations, tutorials, and glimpses of joy in a life that had been anything but easy. She wore bright lipstick, wavy hair, flowing dresses. She smiled in every video, and that smile wasn't just about beauty. It was about defiance. She was no longer hiding. She was declaring, "I am here. But in places like Duhok, visibility came with danger. Whispers followed her. Strangers hurled insults. Clients sometimes canceled appointments when they realized who she was. But Dosski pressed forward, documenting her life and finding comfort in the online community that saw her. Still, part of her heart remained heavy, cut off from her family, from the people she had once loved. She hoped maybe one day they would accept her. One person she hadn't heard from in years was her brother. He had moved abroad, far from the town, the family, the so-called shame. He had been quiet, silent, until one day in early 2022 he messaged her. He said he missed her, asked how she was doing, told her he wanted to see her again. Dosski, full of hope, believed it might be the beginning of a reconciliation. He asked where she lived, where she worked, who her friends were. He said he wanted to come visit. She was excited, nervous, and maybe a little naive. But in a world that had taught her loneliness, the possibility of family meant everything. She gave him directions. He got on a flight to Iraq. But his intentions weren't what they seemed. He had come not to reunite, but to punish, to restore what he saw as the family's honor. In the days before her death, Dosski posted videos smiling, dancing, working. There was no fear on her face, no warning in her voice. She was just living. But on January 28, 2022, everything stopped. Her brother took her to a remote area outside Duhok. They drove together, alone. Maybe she thought they were reconnecting. Maybe she thought they'd talk. Instead, he pulled out a gun. He shot her twice, once in the chest, once in the head. He left her body in a ditch, alone, exposed, and then he fled. A passerby found her lifeless body hours later. The police arrived. Within hours, they identified the killer, her brother. He had used her trust to execute a plan that, in his mind, restored dignity to their name. In reality, he had committed a cold-blooded honor killing. When the news broke, Dosski's friends and clients were devastated. Her online community erupted in grief. Hashtags spread. Her face, full of light and hope, became the image of trans resistance in the Middle East. But justice did not follow. Authorities said they were investigating. No arrest warrant, no extradition. Her brother, whose identity was publicly known, escaped across the border and vanished. Her death faded from headlines in Iraq, but outside the region, she became a martyr. LGBTQ+ rights groups called out the silence. Human rights activists demanded change. But on the ground in Kurdistan, it was quiet, as if her life and her death had meant nothing. But Dosski's story didn't disappear. It grew louder. In her honor, Kurdish queer activists organized underground support networks. Western LGBTQ+ outlets profiled her life. Vigils were held in cities she had never visited. Her face, her bright red lipstick, her confident gaze, was painted on murals from Berlin to Toronto. She became a symbol of visibility, of what it costs to be true to yourself in a world that demands your silence. They say honor lives in the heart, but some twist it into hatred. Dosski Azad wasn't a disgrace. She was a fighter, a dreamer, a daughter. She was killed for living in her truth. But in death, she speaks louder than ever. Say her name, Dosski Azad. I've told stories of people hunted for who they are. I've covered brutal murders and lives stolen in the name of hate. But what you're about to hear is a story of betrayal so deep, it cost a 17-year-old girl everything. She had dreams of becoming a makeup artist, of living her truth openly and joyfully. But her truth became her death sentence. Mercedes Williamson was a teenager from Mississippi. She was bright, beautiful, full of possibility, and transgender. Her life ended in a remote forest with a hammer blow and a knife wound to the neck. Not because she did something wrong, but because someone couldn't bear what she represented. This is the devastating story of Mercedes Williamson, a girl betrayed by someone she trusted and murdered in the name of control, secrecy, and hate. Mercedes Williamson was born on January 17, 1998, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. She was raised by her adoptive mother, Vicki Williamson, a woman who would go on to become her fiercest advocate after her death. From a young age, Mercedes had a flair for style. Her favorite thing to do? Hair and makeup. Her childhood wasn't perfect. She struggled, like many transgender kids, to find her place in a society that didn't understand her. But in her small circle, Mercedes found love and acceptance. Vicki supported her through her gender transition, even when others didn't. She allowed Mercedes to live as her authentic self, and the girl flourished. She had big dreams: to own a beauty salon one day, to inspire other trans girls who felt invisible. She had a soft voice, a bright smile, and a spirit that made people pause. She was just a teenager, but she had the presence of someone who'd lived 10 lives. But even in safe spaces, danger loomed. At just 17, Mercedes began seeing a 28-year-old man named Joshua Valum. He was older, quiet, and kept to himself, but he had a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. Valum was a member of the Latin Kings, a violent street gang known for its brutal code of honor. In the gang, being gay or being involved with a transgender woman was forbidden. It wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a violation punishable by death. But Joshua didn't care, or at least that's how it seemed. He and Mercedes met online. They chatted for months before meeting in person. They spent time together, took photos, went on drives. For a while, Mercedes thought she'd found someone who accepted her fully. But Joshua Valum was playing a dangerous game. He knew the rules of the Latin Kings. He knew if his relationship was exposed, it would cost him his life. And when word got out that people were asking questions, when rumors started flying that Mercedes was transgender and Joshua was her boyfriend, he panicked. On May 30th, 2015, Mercedes was last seen alive. She was seen getting into a silver car in front of her George County, Mississippi home. She told her mother she was going to see a friend. That friend was Joshua Valum. What Mercedes didn't know was that Valum wasn't planning a visit. He was planning an execution. Phone records showed that Valum had spent the prior days researching methods of murder. He had purchased electrical stun devices, knives, and blunt objects. His plan was detailed, calculated, final. He drove her out of Mississippi and into a remote area of Loosedale, across the state line into Alabama. A dense wooded area, far from traffic, far from witnesses, far from rescue. And there, under the cover of trees, he turned on her. According to his later confession, Valum first stunned Mercedes with an electric device. Then he struck her repeatedly in the head with a hammer. But she didn't die. In a panic, as she tried to crawl away, he took out a pocket knife and stabbed her in the neck. Over and over. She was just 17 years old. She died alone in a forest at the hands of someone she once kissed. After the murder, Valum attempted to hide the body. He covered her with debris, drove home, destroyed his phone, tried to clean up the evidence. But what he couldn't destroy was the weight of his guilt. For days, Mercedes was missing. Her friends started raising alarms. Her mother filed reports. But local police were slow to act, misgendered her in public statements, and initially treated her case like a runaway teen situation. But 1 month later, Joshua Valum did something no one expected. He confessed. He told his father what he had done, and his father called the police. Valum led investigators to Mercedes's body in the woods of George County. By then, her remains were badly decomposed, but investigators recovered key evidence linking him to the crime. He was arrested and charged with capital murder under Mississippi state law. But what happened next made history. Prosecutors knew the truth. This wasn't just murder. This was a hate crime. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice charged Joshua Valum under the federal Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, marking the first time in American history that a person was charged with a federal hate crime for targeting a transgender individual. The prosecution laid out the facts. Valum killed Mercedes because she was transgender. He feared gang retaliation if his relationship became public. He chose to murder her rather than face consequences. In May 2017, Joshua Valum pleaded guilty to the federal hate crime charge. Valum was sentenced to 49 years in federal prison on top of his state life sentence. The judge called the murder monstrous and hateful. For Mercedes's family, no sentence could ever balance the loss. But the conviction marked a turning point. Her mother, Vicki Williamson, later said, "My daughter was full of life. She deserved to live. She was beautiful. She mattered." Mercedes became a symbol, not of death, but of change. Her name lives on in court history, in advocacy campaigns, and in the growing fight for justice for trans youth. She was 17. She wanted to be a stylist. She wanted to love and be loved. Instead, she became a victim of silence, shame, and betrayal. Mercedes Williamson never got the chance to open her salon, never got to dance at prom, never got to live the full story she dreamed of. But in her death, she changed American law. Her story reminds us that hate can wear the face of someone you trust, and silence, when loud enough, can kill. Say her name, Mercedes Williamson.